Welcome to MassBio's weekly town hall with President and CEO Bob Coughlin. I'm Jennifer Nason, Senior Director of Communications at MassBio. And before I introduce our special guest, I'd like to turn it over to Bob to say a few words about the current state of our country, as I know we're all sickened by the murder of George Floyd and the systemic racism in our country. Bob, could I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you, Jenny. And, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about what's going on in our country during these sad and crucial moments in our country's history. And, we realize that, MassBio recognizes that our privilege and position and influence across Massachusetts and beyond. I want everybody to know that we're going to utilize our voice to continue and to more aggressively stand up for change, speak out against racism and discrimination, and demand accountability. We're going to continue to support our Black and brown friends, coworkers, and communities while seeking to empower their voices through the platforms that we have, including this one. We're going to continue to push our members to do better and hold them accountable for sustainable change, especially as it relates to promoting underrepresented employees to positions of leadership. When you think about what we do, guys, we're here to heal people. People that are sick, no matter who they are or where they come from. It's on us to solve some of the toughest problems facing humankind. Look what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how to invent a vaccine better. That is so important to everybody who walks on this earth. And this is no different. Racism is a disease, and our industry should be seeking to cure it the same way we do every other disease. So we want to encourage each and every one of you to consider how you can do better and how we can make an impact. And please, we welcome your ideas on what MassBio can do, should do, and can do better, because we are all in this together, and all together we can create a better world for future generations. And I just wanted to share that before we got started. These are unprecedented times because of COVID-19. And now what's going on across our country, we need to stand up, take action, and fix it. Enough talk. So I just wanted to say that before we got started, and I'll hand it back to you, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Bob. And now I'd like to introduce our special guest, Hannu Rajaniemi. He's CEO and co-founder of HelixNano, a company that's working on not only a COVID-19 vaccine, but also a vaccine for future coronaviruses. Welcome, Hannu. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jennifer. Great to be here. And thank you both for that very, very powerful and important opening statement.
Perfect. Well, just, as always, I'm going to dive in with some questions, but we want this to be an interactive discussion. So please, everyone, ask questions throughout using the Q&A tab at the bottom, and we'll get to as many as we can. So first, Hannu, you spent the last 2 years developing cancer vaccines and have now pivoted to work on a COVID-19 vaccine. Can you share with us how you've adapted your cancer vaccine technology for COVID and how you were able to pivot so quickly and what that entailed?
Absolutely. So the mission of HelixNano actually still remains the same. So the long-term goal that my co-founder Nikolai Eroshenko and I set for the company was to develop enabling technologies to bring about a world where freedom from cancer is a fundamental human right. So guarantee access to new therapies and vaccines for everybody. And the way we decided to do that was through bringing the power of synthetic biology to oncology. And the modality we then chose to make that possible was messenger RNA. So essentially not developing drugs or protein-based biologics directly, but use messenger RNA as a way of delivering genetic information to the bodies of patients so that their own cells would actually make the active therapeutic agent or the vaccine. So the advantage that then gave us when we decided to jump into building a COVID-19 vaccine was that we didn't really have to change anything. So we were still designing protein sequences. We were still making messenger RNA and injecting into mice to test those designs and using immunoassays for readouts. Pretty much everything except what we were actually putting into those messenger RNA sequences remained the same. And in fact, if anything, things got easier because working with cancer, you usually have to wait for xenograft to grow, for tumors to grow in mice. So actually the iteration speed even got faster. So technologically speaking, it was a very easy transition.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. So the original Manhattan Project was a research and development undertaking during World War II that produced the first nuclear weapons. You've now proposed the idea of a modern Manhattan Project to expedite vaccine development, suggesting a timeline of 6 months. How is it possible to expedite vaccine development in such a way? And can you tell us a little bit about where you are in this undertaking?
Absolutely. So the original Manhattan Project was a response to an existential threat in a time of war, where it was absolutely essential that the US develop a nuclear weapon before the Germans did. And the approach that the project took very systematically identified all the key technical risks that needed to be addressed to make that possible, and then solved all of those in parallel in multiple different ways. So essentially making sure that there were no single bottlenecks that could sink the whole project. So that meant, for example, developing 3 different ways to enrich uranium in parallel, and an additional way to enrich plutonium in parallel, developing multiple bomb designs. And then also it meant reinventing infrastructure, building massive amounts of infrastructure to actually carry out the uranium enrichment and the deployment of the weapon and so on. And all of this was happening in parallel. So rather than following its usual waterfall method of project management, this massive parallelization was a very key feature. Another aspect that was important was that it wasn't really even about scaling up existing processes, but rapidly developing new ones and rapidly developing new technologies. And when we started thinking about how to apply this idea to vaccine development, that's what was quite striking for me and Nikolai, that it's not just that we need to develop a vaccine faster, we need to reinvent the way we develop vaccines. One aspect of that is of course, how do we run clinical trials better and faster? That's really the bottleneck for vaccine development. Vaccines are held to an extremely high safety standard because you have to give them to healthy people. And the main reason why clinical trials for vaccines take a very long time is that there are rare but serious, sometimes serious adverse effects that you might have to wait quite a long time to see. So, for example, autoimmune diseases, which were seen in the sort of infamous swine flu vaccine in the 70s that caused Guillain-Barré, sort of a neurological autoimmune disease in many patients. So obviously you want to avoid that, but right now we can't really afford the time to wait for a very long time for those things to show up. But so our question was, what if we could actually look for signs of those kinds of adverse effects up front? So in a true vaccine Manhattan Project, you would develop several methods, again in parallel, to doing exactly that. And technologically, we do have a lot of tools that haven't been applied to vaccine development. So it's quite striking how advanced technologically we are on the cancer side compared to the infectious disease and vaccine side. So for example, one of the things we propose is applying modern proteomics technologies to look for the presence of autoantibodies very early on in the vaccine trials to indicate that a vaccine candidate might be causing an autoimmune reaction. Now, one big safety issue that we are very worried about still, which is specific to SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, is called antibody-dependent enhancement. And that's a phenomenon that has been observed in quite a few infectious diseases, including dengue, quite prominently RSV. And what it means is that either a natural immune response or a vaccine can induce antibodies that don't neutralize the virus, but actually give the virus the ability to infect other new cell types like immune cells. So what you can imagine happening is that you have the virus and then you have an antibody sticking out of it that doesn't block its ability to infect cells. And then many cell types actually have receptors for antibody tails for the Fc domain. And suddenly you've helped the virus to infect those cell types. Mm-hmm. So we don't know if this is happening for SARS-CoV-2, but it did happen for SARS, so SARS-CoV-1. And quite strikingly, 3 out of the 4 SARS vaccine candidates that were developed were shown to cause this phenomenon in preclinical animal models. And it wasn't a subtle effect. It really meant like serious lung damage and actually the kind of ARDS type phenotype that we see in serious COVID-19 cases. And now we are pushing forward with more than 100 vaccine candidates around the world. And the vast majority of those are using the same design idea that those SARS vaccines did. So vast majority of COVID-19 vaccines are targeting the spike, full spike protein, the entire spike protein on the surface of the virus, which is what it uses to enter cells. And so at HelixNano, we are quite worried about that it could, we don't, of course, know still whether this risk is real, but if it is, it could actually sink all of these vaccine projects, the vast majority of the clinically advanced vaccine projects. And then, of course, there could be massive loss of public trust as well in this whole effort. So again, in this sort of vaccine Manhattan Project context, that would be something that should be addressed up front, both in terms of figuring out the exact mechanisms of through whether it is happening for SARS-CoV-2, and then developing assays that would allow you to detect that very early. Now, in terms of where we are, we published this proposal in April, and we've been watching the evolution of different vaccine programs around the world, obviously. And there are some encouraging aspects and some less so. The big program in the US, of course, is Operation Warpspeed, which is a big government-led effort trying to get to 300 million vaccine doses by January 2021. So that program does have some characteristics of a Manhattan Project. It's a big, coordinated, centralized effort. They are trying to do some things in parallel, like setting up manufacturing for some of the key vaccine modalities while clinical trials are happening. They are pursuing up to 14 different vaccines, and there is a centralized framework for clinical trials. So those are things that are quite similar to what we proposed as well. But my concern is that they are not necessarily doing this enabling technology development upfront and doing things like developing new assays to look for adverse effects. So Anthony Fauci, for example, has mentioned ADE, antibody-dependent enhancement, in a recent congressional hearing, but in the context of we will be careful and look for signs of it in patients. So it sounds like we are going to inject patients with a potentially risky vaccine and then see what happens, rather than trying to address it up front with technologies that we should already have. So we, of course, at HelixNano are trying to pursue vaccine designs that would mitigate against this risk and some other broader vaccine risks, but we can't deal with every problem. And this ADE issue seems like a very fundamental problem for all vaccine designs. So what we are, in fact, in the process of doing with Nikolai is launching a non-profit, which we're calling CovLab, to validate whether there is an ADE mechanism in SARS-CoV-2 using patient sera, and then if that turns out to be the case, develop an assay to detect that in patients, and this will all be published and open sourced and given freely available for the community to use. So it's not quite the big Manhattan project, but it's at least one key piece that we are taking out, which we feel the bigger efforts are not addressing.
Wow, that's incredible. I think, we've been trying to educate people about this timeline. I mean, vaccines normally take 5 to 10 years to develop, and we're trying to expedite 6 months, even a year is insane. And like you said, there's so many considerations from safety, efficacy take into account. So we commend you on your work, and we're really rooting for you to succeed.
Yeah, and Hannu, we want to thank you, because if you think about the response to this crisis, to this pandemic, has been truly amazing by our industry, not just across the country, but around the world. More specifically to Massachusetts, we have close to 80 companies that are working on either diagnostics, therapeutics, or vaccine research. Okay, that is amazing. Your company is a perfect example of collaboration. You're sitting right now in the Bay Area. You have folks that are here in Lab Central. That's where your company is. But it just goes to show how, both East and West and everything in the middle needs to work together to try to change how we do things so that we can be more successful. I mean, the level of co-op centers and government right now is at an all-time high. And I think it's important to note, why is that happening? Because did you ever think that we'd ever be able to sit here on a virtual Zoom call, right, and at a virtual town hall meeting and say that the most important thing to our world's economy, never mind health and saving lives, but the most important thing to our world's economy right now is a vaccine. So we can't wait 5 to 15 years. Even the idea of 13 months, which is breaking all sorts of records, is something that we can't wait that long. So thank you for this paper. We plan on sharing it with everybody who's on the call. Any of your information as it relates to the new not-for-profit as well, we'll share that with everybody we can, because again, guys, one of the things that I found very interesting about reading your work was when you talk about why this needs to happen. And the fact that, you talked a lot about the phase 3s being a big bottleneck. And, hey, I come to this industry through the cystic fibrosis community. It took 18 years and over $13 billion to invent a drug that worked for my kid. Too long, right? If that could have happened sooner, and I'm grateful, very grateful. But if that could have happened sooner because we do things different, very important. Can you talk a little bit about if we could do a vaccine 6 months sooner than what's projected, what does that mean financially to the world? Never mind the amount of lives saved.
I mean, the numbers are really just absurd, Bob. So right now, even partial lockdowns are literally costing trillions in terms of lost GDP growth.
Trillions with the T.
So if we got a vaccine, let's say 6 months earlier, that would be worth several trillion. And again, the greater aspect is the human lives we could
That's
save
right.
there. But in terms of just in pure cold economic terms, I think a vaccine will enable reopening the economy in a way that other interventions won't. I think there's many other aspects that beyond saving lives that could be important about that as well. Because if we truly develop infrastructure to validate and test and deploy vaccines faster than ever before on these seemingly impossible timescales, that'll have enormous impact. First of all, for stopping any future pandemic. This is not going to be the last pandemic. Well, let's hope we can make this. Our mission is to try to help to make it the last pandemic, but coronavirus is not going to be the last zoonotic virus that we'll have to deal with. There is the quite scary future risk of bioterror, of hostile actors looking at the current situations and going, the world is vulnerable against this kind of attack. So we need to have the infrastructure to stop all those things, not just now, but in the future as well. And then there is this greater public health aspect of actually, lifting up everybody from disease. And if we look at the developing world, I think it's going to be very difficult to bring some of the really expensive gene therapies and cutting edge biologics and immunotherapies and so on to everybody in the world, unless we radically change the way we manufacture them and develop them and bring the costs of doing that down. And vaccines are actually a very powerful modality, which we could apply beyond just infectious diseases as well. I mean, one of the things that we were pursuing prior to the crisis was the idea of prophylactic cancer vaccines. We are starting to have the genomic information to understand how cancer develops through introduction of different driver mutations. What if we could actually vaccinate people against those mutations before they happen? I mean, and even a very small dent in cancer incidence could be huge. And vaccines are a modality that is from the start designed to be deployed worldwide. So if we build the infrastructure now to do that, I think this new world that will emerge into post-pandemic could be, I think, a much better and kinder world than the one we live in now.
Yeah,
that's a wonderful thought. It's a wonderful thought right now.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point kind of around this idea of health equity. And Bob, we've talked about this a lot, how the data around COVID, I mean, it's disproportionately affecting minority populations. So Bob, maybe you can start with this one and talk a little bit about how we can ensure that a vaccine will work for all populations.
Yeah,
especially around clinical trials.
Yeah, and we've said this all along for all the unmet medical need that our industry is trying to solve, right? There's huge disparities. It relates to how we do clinical trials. If you think in a traditional world, it has to be people that maybe have one parent that isn't working so that they can get the patient into the care center. The parking at the care center is not cheap. You have to buy food. You need to take time away from your life to do it. And we've been constantly trying to think, how can we use digital health, right? Digital health was the rave, and how could we use wearables and telehealth and different ways to communicate with the folks at the clinic so that we can manage clinical trials in a way more out in the field so that we could access the population that this invented drug or therapy would be serving. Right? And we've done a horrible job with that. So hopefully another silver lining that can come from this, Hannu, is that we realize if we're going to do this quicker, better, faster, you talk about in your writings how we're going to look at how we enroll in clinical trials, how we make sure that we are addressing disparity, how are we addressing the communities that are most affected from this virus. And I mean, the numbers don't lie. We can see where it is and how it is. So how are we going to get to the people in the field? And those are the outside the box things that we're thinking about. We're working on a program now called Reset, restarting our economy safely through testing and training. Phase 3 is how do we use the depth of innovation here in Massachusetts combined with the academic medical centers so that we can look at platform trials. Let's not have each company have to do a one-off with each clinic, right, at the hospital. Is there a way we can pull it all together? Because again, these companies aren't trying to compete with one another. They all actually hope that someone succeeds faster, right? It's better for humankind. It's better for the economy. So, one of the things that we're the most excited about is some of the good that can come out of this horrible, horrible crisis.
Absolutely.
I absolutely agree with that, Bob. I think one of the issues that the pandemic has starkly brought to light is that access to healthcare really has mattered enormously in terms of the outcomes, and minorities with poor access to healthcare have been the most impacted. And I think that is inherent in the nature of pandemics and of infectious disease, that you can't actually give some people preferred access, because if you don't actually eradicate the disease everywhere, it's going to keep coming back, and we'll all be affected. So actually our incentives are really aligned to guarantee access to everybody.
Thank you both for that. And Bob, you started off just talking about how, Hannu, you're in California, but half your team is in Massachusetts. Those two states are home to the largest life sciences clusters in the world. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how we can support this cross-state collaboration to accelerate innovation, not only around COVID, but all the other unmet medical needs out there. And then, if there are any other collaborations, we also must support in advance. Maybe Bob, you could start, and then Hannu, you could jump in.
Yeah, and it would be awesome, Hannu, if you could talk a little bit about your experience going through Mass Connect, which is part of our innovation services group here in Massachusetts. That's a concept that we talk to the folks at Biocom and we have with Bay Bio and CLSA in the past. We'll share that with anyone across not just the country, but the world, right? I say it often, with the rising tide lifts all boats, right? I love nautical terms, but, living the last 18 years with a son with cystic fibrosis, I could care less where a CF therapy came from, whether it was Massachusetts, California, or Singapore, right? We all need to work together. And right now, the world doesn't care. The world doesn't care where a COVID-19 vaccine is developed, manufactured, or come from. We just need it. We just need it. So, for us to have you here with us today, Hannu, all the way from the West Coast. This is a series of events that we're doing in collaboration with East Coast, West Coast. This isn't a competition about who can be better or this or that. Those days are over, guys, right? There's no time for that. Patients are waiting and the economy is waiting. So thank you for that, Hannu.
No, thank you, Bob. We've certainly, so just to comment briefly on Mass Connect. So that was a really amazing experience. I didn't maybe highlight it before, but I of course didn't even come from a life sciences background into this world. I was originally a theoretical physicist. So to have a group of mentors with deep expertise in all aspects of life sciences early on in the life of the company was extremely valuable. And then it was definitely interesting to combine that with the experience of going through a different kind of accelerator program, Y Combinator on the West Coast. And actually we've been trying to take the best of both worlds in building the company to as much as we've been able to. I think one illustration of the benefits of collaboration has been that we've been able to draw upon both ecosystems. One great example was we have had a very fruitful collaboration with one of Google's AI teams based here, essentially applying some machine learning methods to protein design. Being able to access both investor ecosystems has been helpful. I think there are some other companies that we're friends with who've been able to leverage that, like Dino Therapeutics, who've recently done very, very well. But post-COVID, it's really gotten crazy in the sense that it feels like all the barriers have come down. So we've had conversations with other companies on both coasts who just wanted to help, with academics who freely donated their time to help with vaccine designs. And it feels like in the scientific community, there's just been this general coming down of barriers to collaboration, which I think may well persist even after the crisis is over. And I hope it will.
Perfect. Well, believe it or not, we've just come up to time. That went by in a second, it felt like. But Hannu, thank you so much for joining us. Is there any kind of final thoughts you'd like to provide to the audience before we wrap up?
I think one personal experience I'll share, which may also apply to what is happening in the country right now, is that so before we decided to launch the vaccine project in early March, I personally felt very, very afraid and anxious and powerless and helpless and couldn't sleep and was under this constant weight. And then when we decided to do something, that went away. So taking action to try to address the crisis in some way really helped and was really empowering and positive. And I think that applies to both pandemic and both the systemic racism that we're seeing, that if each of us takes one action, no matter how small, even if it's just donating money or speaking out or supporting people who are directly affected by all these things, then I think we will lose this sense of powerlessness and helplessness, and find it easier to find hope. So that's a thought I'll leave you with.
Wow.
Thank you.
What a beautiful
I don't know
way.
if you could have said it better.
No, I know. What a beautiful way to end this, because again, I mean, action it is therapeutic, right? In so many ways. And if, not being a doctor, not being a scientist, and having a kid that was sick, I didn't know what else to do other than to get involved. And I think this issue that our country is facing right now, the only thing that will affect change is action and involvement. And we can all do it, whether it's a little part, medium part, or a big part. All those parts help. And it does. It starts at home. It starts with our family. It starts with ourselves. And then we just branch out and we go. So thank you for sharing your time with us today. Thank you for getting an early West Coast start so you could meet us East Coast time over here. And thank you, most importantly, for all that you do each and every day to help sick people. That's the most important thing. I can't think of a more noble profession. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you for having me.
Great.
Have a great
Thank
day.
you so much, everyone in the audience, and we look forward to seeing you next week, where Congresswoman Clark is going to join us to talk a little bit about the federal response to all of these issues. So thank you, everyone. Have a good week, and we'll see you next week.